Good afternoon, and welcome to part 2 of our 5-part series of lunchtime presentations on recovering women's legacies, artists, dealers, collectors, and patrons. This series, as you know, is being held on the 5 Wednesdays this June from 12 to 1 p.m. Today, Elizabeth Gorayeb, Executive Director of the Wildenstein Plattner Institute, and Jennifer Gimblett, Senior Researcher and Project Manager of the paintings of Paul Gauguin, 1891 to 1903, will tell us about their determined effort to recover the identities of women owners within the provenances of paintings by Gauguin. Their talk is entitled Madame X, Women Collectors in Provenance Research. Following the WPI team, Louisa Ruby, Head of Research, that's me, and Samantha Deutch, Assistant Director for the Center of the History of Collecting at the Frick Art Reference Library, will highlight collaborative projects initiated by the Frick that have maximized the working methodologies for those engaged in provenance research and the history of collecting. Our presentation is entitled Transforming Research Methodologies, a Digital Approach. Each group will speak for about 20 minutes, and for the last 15 minutes, we will answer questions from all of you. As you think of them, please put your question in the Q&A box, which is on the lower left there, and please do not use the chat box. You can make comments there to other people if you like, or to individual panelists, but put your questions for the end of the program in the chat, the Q&A, sorry. Okay, here we go, and Elizabeth, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Louisa. So I am here on behalf of the Wildenstein Plattner Institute to talk about our efforts in putting together the Gauguin catalogue raisonné. It's a digital catalogue raisonné. You can find it on our website, wpi.art, and the hyperlink directions are at the bottom of the screen. Now, catalogue raisonnés are really not thought of as in terms of deep dives in provenance and recovering of identities in provenance, but they're very tempting to use them for that, especially if you're doing provenance research. So when our team was putting together the Gauguin catalogue raisonné, we had to ask ourselves, to what extent are we going to list the owners, and to what extent are we going to make an effort to identify them? And oftentimes there are mysterious names in provenances, and more often than not, those mysterious names are the names of women. So with that, I'm going to give you a deep dive into an example of how this research goes about. And I just want to start by encouraging you to take a look at our website, and you can go to our filter screen. And what I've done here is I've researched all of the works in the Gauguin catalogue raisonné that were owned by women, and I simply put in the word Mrs. into the provenance box, and 33 results came up. And out of these 33, I chose one example. This is a picture that's currently at the Norton Simon Museum. It's called Jeune Fille et Garçon. And when you look at the provenance listing, you'll see that it says it was in the collection of Mrs. Austin Martin, Scotland. Who is Mrs. Austin Martin, other than the wife of Austin Martin? That's our question right now. So usually when provenance researchers or those who are looking at catalogue raisonnés have a look at these provenance listing, they're looking for gaps. And gaps in the provenance historically are thought of as lapses in time and gaps in the history of ownership. But for this exercise, I'd like you to think about gaps in a different way in terms of gaps in identity. So we're going to use Mrs. Austin Martin here as an example of that. So if I want to know who is this Austin Martin, of course, I go on a deep dive and a rabbit hole in Google, and I start off by Googling the provenance, and of course, I find a New York Times article from 1964 that shows the sale of this painting. Now, at the time, this was a big deal because the painting was considered lost for 40 years. No one knew the whereabouts of this major Gauguin. And according to this article, the painting remained in obscurity in a Scottish castle until its owner decided to sell it. The owner was noted as Mrs. Austin Martin, an American-born widow of the son of a director of the Imperial Tobacco Company. And it goes on to say that she was seated in the audience. Now, interestingly, the person who wrote the article didn't feel compelled to go up to her and say, "Who are you?" However, the author did go up to the buyer, who happened to be Armand Hammer, who owned the Hammer Galleries, and was, a captain of industry in the United States. And he asked Mr. Hammer about the painting after he bought it, and Mr. Hammer acknowledged this was a great buy. But Mrs. Austin Martin sat in the audience, somewhat unrecognized and unquoted. So with the information that I had here, you, of course, we know there is an Austin Martin who is related to someone of an Imperial Tobacco Company connection. So with that search in mind, I found a very curious article, this one from the Houston Chronicle, and it talks about a Professor Austin Martin. Now, this article is very unusual because it talks about Professor Austin Martin as an eccentric who lived in this crazy castle in Houston that was being torn down in the late 1950s because aside from the fact that it was overrun with rodents and bugs, it was also alleged to be haunted. So now we're getting into sensational territory, and I really want to know, again, who this family actually is. Now, my clues to who Mrs. Martin are actually, they're in the article, but you sort of have to read between the lines. So we have three clues. Number one is she's obviously the professor's wife. She's living in the castle with her, it says 5 unschooled and scantily clad children living somewhat modestly, but it also says, and this was interesting to me, that the plans for the castle were drawn by Martin and his wife Marie, so there's her first name, who had copied the design from a house they owned somewhere in North Africa. Now that's interesting. She clearly has architectural leanings and is world traveled and is equipped enough to design the drawings for a house. The third clue, and this was I found to be the most compelling, it says that Austin Martin himself is not the person who actually commissioned the castle. It came from Marie, because Marie was the person who could pay for it and had the money for it. So this was, again, another sign that there must be a story behind this person, Marie Martin. So doing some more investigating, indeed, I found out that Mrs. Martin was a graduate of Cornell University in 1918, and her name was Marie Therese Dickey. So this is, you're looking at a alumni newsletter from the 1930s, and I was able to find this because I had the address of the crazy haunted castle in Houston. But with this information, I managed to track down an heir to Marie Therese Dickey, who told me some very interesting things over the telephone. He said, first and foremost, his grandmother, who was known as Mimi, was a classics scholar, and she was one of the first women to graduate from Cornell with a PhD in classics. She also had 9 children, and this heir was very insistent to tell me that the money came from her. That's all he told me. He said he didn't really have a lot to say. I didn't want to speak on behalf of the family, but in terms of follow the money, I thought this was an intriguing bit of information. And it so happens that Marie Dickey's father was Andrew Dickey, who was the superintendent for the Aluminum Company of America. So clearly this was a sizable amount of money. And it also confirmed that Marie Dickey purchased the Gauguin herself. When she sold it in the 1960s, it was right after her husband had died, and the picture hung in her bedroom. So again, we can extrapolate what her feelings were about this picture and what compelled her to sell it following the death of her husband. She remained in the castle until her death in 1982, and the castle is now currently existing in Scotland as a bed and breakfast, apparently. But nonetheless, it goes to show that there is a story behind this person whose name was pretty much deleted from the catalogue raisonné historically. Now, because of the beauty of an online catalogue raisonné, we can go back and correct this. But I present this to you today not because it's an unusual story. It's quite a common story to have the names of people in a catalogue raisonné for whom we don't know anything about. This type of research challenges our assumptions about collectors and their motivations. It calls to question the identity of the rainmakers credited for shaping cultural history. And it also forces us to broaden the definition of patronage and to cast a wider net when discussing the network of people who were involved in this pursuit. We're also compelled to consider the roles and the efforts of the silent partners responsible for the decisions about what was in and what was out of a collection. And in order to fully understand what we're missing in these provenance listings, we have to do the work to uncover it. It really does open up new portals of exploration for art historians. And for those of you who are interested in provenance history, with the increasing amount of digital catalogues, raisonné online, there are a lot of opportunities to be had in doing research like that and uncovering new significant characters in the narratives of these paintings. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Jennifer Gimblett, who was the head researcher for the Provenance on the Gauguin catalog raisonné. And she'll be speaking about her work doing just this, along with the obstacles she encountered during this pursuit and the protocols that she and her colleagues put in place to restore many of these women into the narrative of the Provenance. Jen?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let me just share my screen with you all. So that was a really wonderful introduction to sort of pretty much what we were doing every day for about 2 years at this point. And as Elizabeth mentioned, our goal in compiling these provenances for the WPI's Gauguin Digital Catalog Raisonné project was really to provide first names to female collectors wherever possible. We really wanted to sort of do away with the traditional references where a woman's selfhood and identity had been completely subsumed by her marriage and the association with her husband. So typically when we're researching, we find these references in source material that overwhelmingly refer to women as Mrs. husband's first and last names, or a couple jointly, customarily are recorded as Mr. and Mrs. husband's first and last name. But we felt strongly, especially as a team of entirely female researchers, that, we really wanted to sort of, not only for the purposes of research, but also just sort of course correct a bit. So references we had such as, Mrs. Arthur Lehman would become Adele Lewison Lehman, or, a couple, we'd have Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Lewitt, that would always become Alexander and Elizabeth Lewitt. And so we really felt, especially in the context of provenance, when we refer to a woman by her first name, it really can clarify precisely who it is we're speaking about, because I'll go into a few examples here in a moment, but sometimes it really gets convoluted and we cannot discern which, the attempt to sort of reconcile who these women were, and sort of in order to provide these women with their full identity, we really did this deep dive that Elizabeth just demonstrated. It really requires getting a familiarity with their biography of the individual, which can sometimes seem like an extra step, but it's sort of a necessary step to uncover their identity as a collector, especially. And depending on their status and visibility in society, this can be really discovered with varying degrees of difficulty, or the amount of research that's involved in that. We've found, typically the historical record contains exhaustive details for their husbands, fathers, brothers, male relatives, but the omissions of details pertaining to these women and their women's familial history, they're there. They're not as readily traceable, but if you look for them, we can sort of pick them out of the history. So we found that this largely, it's sort of the erasure of these detailed identities of this woman is largely facilitated through the adoption of her husband's surname and then the passing of his surname on to the successive generations. So for provenance, this sort of maintenance of the surname is helpful when we're trying to show, succession and inheritance through subsequent generations on sort of the patrilineal side. But while we were conducting our research, we realized that there were definitely cases we had where we had female collectors in the provenance, and we knew that these artworks passed directly to their daughters and granddaughters. So it felt really necessary to us to include these female owners, their familial surnames, their maiden names, to sort of create the clear and direct ties to the previous owner in these cases as well. It's sort of, the default is sort of we don't include her maiden name every time, but we do have these instances where it's actually really helpful to be able to show this. So what we ended up doing, just to back up, so the WPI style, we indicate through these line breaks when a work has changed ownership. And so the terms inherited from the above or by descent, these are sort of an indication of a direct transfer between one line and the other. And we found that by using these brackets, we were able to sort of put a bracket around the sort of matrilineal name. And then through that, we could really illustrate this path of inheritance when it passed through these successive generations of women. So this is especially important for this painting, painted in 1893. So we knew from historical records that Anne-Marie Sancerre, who was listed as Madame au Sancerre throughout the 1930s and 40s, so we knew that she received the painting upon her husband's death in 1923. And then sometime after her own death, probably around 1945, the painting was passed to her daughter and her daughter's descendants. So we felt it would be really important to sort of include this maiden name on each subsequent line. That way we could just really show sort of who these women were, both in their married life and in their sort of previous life as well. We didn't regularly include this for all of the women in our provenances, just because we felt it was a bit of an overburdening of information when the collector was known by her married name for her lifetime or most of her lifetime. So we would just sort of include this little bracketed information just as a helpful hint for our reader to show who these people really were. This was sometimes challenging to sort of develop a set of rules about how she was known versus how we would prefer to use her name. So I wouldn't say we always agreed on this, and it definitely was a situation we went around. But we definitely felt the clarity gained from being able to list both the first and last name, and in some cases the maiden and married name really became sort of the ideal standard that we hope to achieve for most of the provenances. Of course, there were definitely cases where it became apparent we were just unable to discern with any degree of certainty the identity of the women who made up these histories. This largely is the sort of the prevalence of these historic citations that place women in the periphery. So this is sort of, complicating the already complex process of compiling artwork histories. Especially the way we've referred to women with their personal identities tied to that of their husbands, it can lead to confusion about ownership, joint ownership especially, and sort of who is really acting in the role of the collector in any given situation. So a key tool we use to establish the histories of ownership are auction catalogs, exhibition catalogs, and checklists. So these are sort of our contemporaneous documents that allow us to pinpoint ownership continuity and sort of a timeline beyond the event of like a known purchase or a sale. So throughout 19th, 20th century, we find that the common reference of lenders and consignors was again using the husband's name as the identifier, as was customary. And so at a cursory glance, it seems to really offer us a look at, the collecting practices and ownership of women, but it's often more complicated and it doesn't really fully express, the full extent of identity or ownership. When we have maybe, a Mrs. X, and there's been multiple marriages to the same man, how can we tell which of these, Mrs. X's it is? Or are we meant to assume that the work is owned jointly between the couple but the wife has acted as the primary contact for the loan. Therefore, it's mentioned in the catalog, or, is in these situations, is she the primary collector and therefore the decision maker regarding, lending or purchase or sale? So we found that it's often hard. These subtleties of ownership are somewhat lost when we have these little more like a broad sort of use of her name. So it really became a question to us of, when do we list both the couple? When do we list just the man, just the woman? What if we have her name in a sale ledger, but he's listed as the lender? Can we automatically assume that they own it jointly? So during these stages of our research, we were often left with more questions than answers. And occasionally some of these questions remained within our provenances, despite, our best efforts to untangle them. So what follows are two instances where we find our research team was unable to make confirmation of these identity of these women. So our first quandary is between that of mothers and daughters in the line of succession. So we have the art patron and collector Gustave Fayet. He left Gauguin's self-portrait to either his wife or his daughter upon his death in 1925. So we have references to a Madame d'Andoc, which could possibly be his wife, who was Madeleine Fayet. She was born Madeleine d'Andoc. This would be a reference to her surname before her marriage, but it would be more common that she maintained her married name throughout her life. So she probably would have been known as Madame Fayet until her death, as it doesn't appear to us that she had ever remarried. So therefore, the Madame d'Andoc that we received reference of could also be Fayet's daughter, Isolde Fayet, who married her first cousin, thus becoming Madame d'Andoc. So knowing that some of the works passed directly to Fayet's children upon his death in 1925, we have another Gauguin in the catalog that one of his sons inherited. We could surmise that the Madame d'Andoc referenced would be Isolde Fayet, inheriting the work sort of directly from her father. But without further confirmation, we just felt it was a more prudent decision to leave the provenance line as sort of this vague reference, and then included sort of an explanation in the footnote, sort of why this was confusing or why this wasn't totally clear. But, of course, if either of their first names had been associated with this reference at any point, it would have been much, much easier to confirm to whom the work was passed. So this one remained a mystery, and we do hope at some point that we'll be able to sort of discern with much more certainty if it was in fact his daughter. Another issue that we came across definitely a few times was sort of, when adopting her husband's surname, the identity of the female owner really gets further complicated when the possibility exists that there are multiple women who have married to the same man. So when multiple wives, who have sort of had the same married name overlap in the historical record, it can kind of be difficult to determine who is who. So in this case, we have Henry Huddleston Rogers Jr., who is married 3 times. His first wife, Mary Rogers, he had a daughter, Mary Millicent Abigail Rogers. So Mary Rogers and Henry Huddleston Rogers were divorced in 1829, but in the 40s, we have lending activity by Mrs. H. Henry Huddleston. And so H. Henry Huddleston Rogers. And so it could very well have been that Mary Rogers maintained her married name throughout her life, despite her divorce. But there is also a possibility that it could have been one of the other wives of Henry Huddleston Rogers Jr. It seemed to us probably more likely that Mary Rogers would have given the work to her daughter, as that's sort of our next line in provenance. But we were unable to cover any clear confirmation of this. So this little element of doubt sort of led us to leave her as the vague Mrs. Henry Huddleston Rogers Jr. for the time being, hoping that eventually we will be able to get some new information about sort of the first name and therefore the identity of exactly who this person was. So as recently, as the 1990s, we have consistently maintained sort of this usage of the husband's first name and surname. And this does definitely sort of evolve as we see museum gifts and loans and bequests using both names of the couple. And especially now, as Elizabeth mentioned, with sort of these digitized records and the genealogical records, it's become increasingly more likely that we'll be able to narrow these down, make these connections, and sort of reinsert these women as active participants in the collecting activities. And then, so one instance, we were able to really successfully clear up the confusion and sort of reestablish the name and identity of an owner, was the case of M. Segal. Historically, the ownership of the work you see on your screen after the Stanley Barbie sale in 1944 had been attributed to Maurice Segal. So when the name Marie Stouffer Segal was added to the provenance at a later date, the assumption sort of was that Marie Stouffer Segal was somehow related to Maurice Segal and therefore acquired the work from him. We tried repeatedly to sort of make this connection, but it became really clear to us that it was not a familial relationship we could determine at all. So during our research, it was discovered that one of the records was inscribed as the buyer was M. Segal. And so this was sort of the likely culprit of the confusion. And we think that it had been interpreted as sort of shorthand for either Monsieur Segal or M for Maurice Segal. We returned to the auction house and they were kind enough to reconfirm with their records, which turned out actually the name inscribed in the official auction records was Marie Segal. And the work had never actually been owned by Maurice at all, but was purchased directly by Marie Stouffer Segal at the auction. Later, the work was resold, I think in 1985, by one of her descendants. So we were able to confirm through the genealogical record that it actually had been something that she purchased on her own and then maintained throughout her family. So this really demonstrates for us the way in which historically we've not been able to sort of gain the perspective on ownership and collecting activities by women as the sort of necessary labor to make these corrections, to seek out the women in the historical context, that work has only sort of really begun. So we're definitely hoping to continue to work towards a greater clarity for this in our own projects. And thankfully, through our digital platform, we will be able to continue to make updates and additions as more information comes to light.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. I looking at this, I think how much easier it will be for researchers in the future to recover women's legacies, because you're doing all this work at this point in creating these new online resources. When you have legacy data like the Frick does that we digitize, et cetera, and you also have that as well at the Plattner Institute, it makes it much harder to have to go back through retrospectively and do all this incredible research that you've done. So I'm just shouting you out for doing it now and enjoying the fact that future researchers will have an easier time. So anyway. Okay, my name is Louisa Wood Ruby, as I said earlier, and today I would like to talk to you about transforming research methodologies, a digital approach. In the past 20 years, the Frick Art references, like the Plattner Institute and other cultural heritage institutions, has made a massive and expensive effort, as you can imagine, to transfer as many as possible of their resources into digital form. The many databases and online archival collections we've collectively created can be valuable research tools, as has been highlighted in these today and in last week's presentation as well. But they only are somewhat limited in some ways because in terms of ease of searching and manipulation of data. And recently, some scholars have begun to realize that there's more to the computer than just a database that you search through and try and find things, which is sort of the way we've been doing things, from the early 2000s up until more recently. In the past 10 years, we've begun to realize that really we need to come together with computer engineers and scientists to highlight some of the great, programming skills that can bring the art history itself into a more modern way of doing research, just kind of to transform research from just kind of searching and hunting and stuff, but actually have the computer do some of the work for you. And the Frick formed a digital art history lab in 2015 or so to address these kinds of issues, to try and highlight these issues for our researchers and to research them ourselves and see how we could implement them in our own work. And Samantha and I today would like to show you a few projects that we have either spearheaded or been involved in over the past few years that we feel have, begun to contribute to this effort, or we hope so at any rate. So the first project I'd like to highlight is Pharos. It's an international consortium of photo archives found in 2013 by 14 international art research institutes. You see their names on the left of the screen. They're European and American, essentially. Together, these institutes highlight and contain over 20 million images of works of art with accompanying scholarly documentation. And we realized at that point in 2013 that if instead of researchers, going on, 14 different digital platforms, if they could come together in one digital platform to look at all this rich information at the same time and even compare the information, it would be incredibly valuable. And the kinds of things that you can find in photo archives, as you see on the back here of these photographs, are, scratches. Sometimes these photographs were given by scholars. They have provenance information. They have gallery information. They have photographer information. They have dates of the photographs. So you could have a photograph of a work of art from 1920, one from 1960, one from 1980, and paintings change over time. And if you have 3 different photographs, you could see if there had been a conservation damage, or if someone had added or subtracted parts of their photo archive. This actually happened. I mean, people would add in a little angel or take out an ugly face, and then somebody else would paint it back in later. I mean, sort of something that a lot of us don't really realize or think of. But it's when you see these photographs, you realize they're works of art. Well, someone attacks them or spills acid on them, or they get repaired, and the paintings change physically. So currently, the Pharos Consortium is in the 24th month of a 30-month project supported by a grant from the Mellon Foundation to create this platform with approximately 2 million images from 6 of the 14 institutions. So the pilot project uses something called Research Space, which is based at the British Museum, and which also funded by the Mellon Foundation. And it's one of the few applications that's able to leverage many of the benefits promised by something called linked open data. Now, probably many of you have not heard of this and probably don't really want to, but it really has some real benefits and some possibilities for researchers because it can take data from different data sets on different websites and bring it all together into one common platform, which is what we're trying to do with Pharos. And it integrates these results, and researchers will be able to make comments and annotations, download images, use them in their own presentations. And they can even make their own data sets. So it's a very exciting new way to work online. So now 6 months into the grant period, from the end of the grant period, which is December of 2021, we have very promising results. We'll be able to add 2 or 3 more archives to the group, which will get up to about 3 or 4 million images. And we can see how it's beginning to provide a rich resource for scholars. The URL, as you see in the upper left, is artresearch.net, but you can't go there now because it's not open to the public, even though we're only 6 months from the end. It's still private. We're still working on the site and the functionality, and there's glitches, but we're getting there. And this is what it will probably look like. Maybe not exactly this in 6 months' time, but we shall see. And we already have a built-in search for artworks created by women artists. And eventually we will put in a sort of a search that's very easy for researchers to look up collectors and dealers as well. I'm not sure about patrons because that might be harder to parse out if they're collectors or actually patrons. Did they actually commission the work? And just for the more technically minded among you who do know about linked open data, these searches, these kind of searches that parse out the gender of the artists, collectors, or dealers are made possible by linked open data because Pharos connects to the Getty's data set, ULAN, or the Union list of artist names, and pulls the information on a given woman artist, in this case, Sophie Anderson, and brings it into the Pharos site. And this shows you all the information from the Gettys. Now, even though the Gettys, ULAN is not quote, part of Pharos, it's an open data set, and we can pull it into Pharos. And as more and more data sets of information on our historical researchers become what they call open, a platform such as Pharos can pull those data sets into it and then use it, which is that's the sort of promise of linked open data. Something a little simpler for most of us to understand is reverse image search. And Pharos realized early on that this was incredibly valuable for comparing not only the images in the photo archive, but also the data that they contain. Now, this is not the actual platform because reverse image search in the platform is somewhat functional, but was not going to provide me with a nice slide like this. But these are 3 different photographs in 3 different photo archives, the National Gallery of Art, Library, Villa Itati, and the Frick, of the same work of art. And as you see from the data that's on the screen, it's slightly different in each case. So the National Gallery has it as anonymous Tuscan, and Villa Itati has it attributed to Vigoroso da Siena. That's not Provenance. In this case, nobody knows where this painting is. But in the future, that will also, the Provenance information will be different. That's pulled from the different institutions. And one institution might know that this painting had been in, let's say, a women's collection, whereas another institution did not realize that, did not have that piece of information to add to their photo archive. And so in that way, Pharos will bring the information from all the photo archives together and will be able to sort of add to Provenance information, whether they're women or men, in fact, of course. Now, I just want to show you one more example of reverse image search working very well for highlighting the collections of women. And this is actually Samantha's search that she did. As she'll tell you later, she has been working for quite a while on the collector Mary Jane Morgan. And Mary Jane Morgan had a large sale that took place of her artworks after her death. The sale was in 1886. Samantha was looking for this work of art was in Morgan's sale, and the auction catalog mentioned that it had been sold to F.O. Matthiessen. So Samantha then looked in the auction catalog of F.O. Matthiessen and was able to find an actual image of this work of art that had been in Morgan's sale. So what she did was she scraped that image and she uploaded it into Google reverse image search, which I just can't recommend enough. And they gave her this visually similar images, including, yay, this very similar one. I don't know, some of these others are a little odd, but sometimes you win, and she did in this case. And she found that this work of art was in the LaSalle Peru High School in LaSalle, Indiana, and she wrote to the high school and confirmed that they do now indeed own that image, so she knows not only its location, but also has a nice color image for you. So I'll end my presentation with the URLs of the Pharos website. For more information, pharosartresearch.org, and the platform, which will be open next January, artresearch.net. So now I turn you over to Samantha, who will talk more about Mary Jane Morgan, but we'll start, I believe, with the Archives Directory for the History of Collecting, and Aries, a joint project we worked on, art image exploration space.
Thank you, Louisa. Yes, indeed. I'm going to begin with the Archives Directory for the History of Collecting, which is featured on your screen here. And I also added a link in the chat if you're not familiar with this resource. So I started working on this in 2007 and continue to add, update, augment, etc. It was first published in 2010. And it holds roughly 2,300 records that will itemize collectors, dealers, and galleries. And this is specific to the United States, just to let you know that. So you can see, if you want to see how much information we have from what time period, you can go to our data snapshot and kind of see most of the information is here in the mid-1900s, but we have our peaks and valleys too. You can find out more about the directory from the home page, methodologies behind the research, etc. You can also search, just a keyword search here. It's like your Google search, or you can browse alphabetically by the last name. And you can now search by a map. So this is very similar to if you're looking for a restaurant using Yelp. You can come in here and search, and it's a dynamic. I'm not doing a live preview just for any problems that could occur with that. So I'll show you a few things. So if I were just to look and see how many women are in the archives directory in general, and I didn't change any of the timelines or anything, I just hit the gender F, a map is revealed. If I look for dealer or gallery, it's a much smaller map. I have less dealers that are women in the archives directory. If I can change, like this one, I changed the dates to 1740 to 1930. It's still women. And I changed the role to collector. You'll see there's quite a few. I mean, I have some in Hawaii, Egypt, Europe. There is a dearth around the East Coast because I'm on the East Coast. So I tend to get information more readily accessible that way, although I've been pushing through the West. Last week, Sally Brazil brought up the dealer, Alice Krillman, and there was a lot of interest about where her archives were located. So here I just showing the search. If we put Krillman in, and then when you click on a dot, you get sort of a small bio for that person. Here are the paintings that Miss Krillman sold to Henry Clay Frick. The upper left-hand corner is not a painting that Frick bought. It's a portrait of Krillman by the American artist Gary Melchers. And then just to the right of that, I have a passport photo of hers, which I got from Ancestry.com. So I use Ancestry a lot to find hidden information for people. She was married to the journalist, James Krillman. And as we've discussed before, so here's her entry, and I put those paintings in because it's Frick. And then I also have a little bio on her, and you'd also see her family members. This would help researchers find information that might be buried in other people's archives. And you can look down and see if someone asked where are all the archives on Krillman. So I thought I would show this entry. Now the top entry from Ohio State University Library says James Krillman papers. And Alice Krillman was from Marietta, Ohio, and she donated these papers to the Ohio State University Library. However, archivists and catalogers in the past, this is kind of changing now, have changed their practices. It really should say James or Alice and James Krillman papers, since she was the one who gave it to them. But at the time, I only had this information, and I reached out to the library. This is in 2010, and I asked them if there was any papers for Alice Krillman. And as it turns out, there were folders that were specifically about her art dealing. And now the online finding aid references that. In the past, the first finding aid that I discovered, it just said there were papers by family members there as well. So always dig. If you can't find something on a woman, find their male relative and check out their archives. Now, at first blush, you think I'm showing you, I am talking about a male collector. His name is Albert Rothbart. And I had found, while researching for names for the directory, a 1926 New York Times article about this person, Albert Rothbart, who was selling 114 works that he owned. He was going into a new direction in his purchasing. However, I couldn't find a catalog. I couldn't find an auction catalog, nothing that referenced him after 1926. I did, however, find an entry that he married this famous photographer, journalist photographer, Toni von Horn, and she's famous for the picture on the right of Albert Einstein. And searching Rothbart and von Horn, I was able to find an article that was addressing a purchase that the couple made. And using the property information, I was able to find that the Rothbart Foundation, so now the name is Roothbert Foundation, which the couple formed in 1958. And they together were collecting works of art by Seurat, Modigliani, Matisse, Derain, Stella, O'Keeffe, Blummer, and sculpture from other countries, including China and Egypt, among others. So there was definitely a trail to be discovered, which was fun. And this is interesting because the man changed his name, but I found it through the woman. So just kind of wanted to share that with you a little bit. Now here's Mary Morgan, as Louisa talked about. It's funny, she's my third example because she's one of the people I found very early on working in the archives directory, actually my first week. And before, I just want to tell you, before I even had my stack tour, so you'll understand why I didn't know we had the catalog. I searched our online catalog for Mary Morgan because I had found all these really great articles about her sale, and pretty much anybody who was collecting at the time had been to her sale. The Huntingtons, the Havemeyers, Henry Walters purchased from her sale. It was featured, the sale took place from March 5th to the 15th. And it was highlights from the sale were given every day. It was a blockbuster. And it has actually set an auction record that wasn't to be beat until 24 years later in 1910, when the Chicago financier Charles Yerkes sold his collection of paintings for $1.7 million. So here's her entry, and what you'll discover in the archives directory. If I have a lot of information, it's because I couldn't find the archives, but I'm giving you breadcrumbs so that hopefully you can find information later. And also, I just want to point out that I have the full name here, Mary Jane Sexton Morgan, in the historical note, but in the name at the top, it's what the Library of Congress uses, and it was for interoperability reasons, so that you could search our catalog, or you could search the photo archive, you could search WorldCat for secondary resources or archives that have been newly processed and are discoverable. I had this great auction catalog, like I told you. I looked it up, I couldn't find it. I ended up buying a copy on eBay. I was like, I'm gonna give this to the library. They don't have it yet, they need it. I had my stack tour. I went downstairs, we have everything, we had everything arranged chronologically, and we ended up having 3 copies of the book. However, again, I'm talking about cataloging practices. Her name was not associated with this sale. Her contemporaries, male contemporaries, I might say, like A.T. Stewart, his sale, there was the subject A.T. Stewart was given. So you could search A.T. Stewart and his auction catalog would come up. Since I discovered this, our auction catalog does have Mary Jane Morgan related to it. I also found another beautiful, tiny little catalog that was just Mrs. Morgan's paintings. There's like many Morgans in the world, so it didn't really help you find that information. I found it just one day going through the stacks, and it was this tiny little leather-bound catalog that Morgan created for people visiting her home to see her paintings, and it just featured the paintings, and it said where the paintings were hanging in the home, so as you walked around you could see what they were. That has since been digitized. So has her catalog, all 3 actually, because they're annotated in different places. And I know where things were hanging in her home in 1884 from that article, from the catalog that I discovered. which is great. And I have used both catalogs as an archive. I have found some stuff, and I'll let you know that later on. So in addition to searching the Frick photo archives, our auction catalog, digitized catalogs, the Internet Archive, which I love because you can get granular searches and find like maybe a paragraph on Mary Morgan in some article, but it just adds to that story for her. I discovered this database, Joconde, and this searches across all the French cultural collections. And I had been looking for this detail, and this was an etching done by the American artist W.H. Shelton for Morgan's catalog, and I hadn't been able to find the painting itself. But when I searched Joconde, I found this wonderful entry, and it has the French title of the original title of the work of art. And this picture was taken in 1883 once it was created. So I can't tell you enough, if you're looking for works of art that are in France, the Joconde is your place to go. Another great thing that helped me find particularly prints that Mary Jane Morgan owned was she had a collector's mark, which was very rare for a woman in the 1880s to have, an American woman at that. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, it was MJM. It's in this beautiful blue color. And then they also reprint it in black and white, just so you can see the different ways. And they do have a little thing. They talk about the sale here, which is really great. But I searched Google, and I searched, this is in, Fritz Lucht online catalog of collector's marks. And so I searched Google, I searched Lucht 1879. Those are just the keywords that I used. And it took me to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. So as it turns out, she purchased prints from Morgan's cell, which is really cool, right? And this is early in Gardner's career as a collector. And they happen to have on their website the receipt from that, which is pretty cool. So I'm adding to kind of like Morgan's archives or collections, finding things. Also, one of the prints that was featured is this portrait of Rembrandt. And this was actually part of the theft in 1990. I don't know if you have all had the opportunity to see the Netflix show or documentary called "This Is a Robbery: The World's Biggest Art Heist." But this is a little print that they said the woman kept in her bra and like pulled out. You'll have to see the thing to understand that. But at any rate, Isabel also purchased these decorative works. So she purchased these jade carvings and this beautiful vase in the right, this Chinese vase. And she bought a book from the sale. And I just want to show you a picture of that, which is great. I don't have all the time in the world to talk about Morgan. I wish I did. There's a lot more I've dug up from looking at Department of Buildings records, alterations to buildings records. You just really have to scratch and look in every corner. I've even gone through a collection about 500 postcards to try to find a picture of her home, because that was demolished at the beginning of the 20th century to make way for a large building. However, I'm going to make a plug for this new book, What's Mine is Yours, Private Collectors and Public Patronage in the United States. And these are essays in honor of Inga Riest. And I have a chapter, so if you want to learn more, check that out. Also, tomorrow is a event. So that's my little shameless plug. So with that, I will send it back to Louisa and Q&A. Louisa.
Hi, everybody. How are you? Okay, the first question is for Elizabeth from Amanda Dorval. It is fascinating how you came to find out so many more rich details about Marie Marden. Is it typical for this kind of provenance research to shed such light on women who purchased, sold, auctioned, etc., who were only referenced in the catalogs as Mrs. Husband's name, or is this exceptional?
Thanks for that question, Amanda. I think right now, it is somewhat exceptional that this research is done, because provenance research oftentimes is, and this depth of provenance research is oftentimes considered secondary to the pursuit of putting together a catalogue raisonné. And I know there's another question in the Q&A about whether this is actually genealogical research versus art history. And I think I would argue that as art history and art historians have more access to digitized resources and the internet, genealogy and genealogical research becomes part and parcel with the art historical practice. So while this hasn't traditionally been done, I think there's a greater temptation and almost a cultural and sociological impetus to do this type of research going forward.
Okay, thank you. From Vivian Barnett, what if the wife had no interest in art or in deciding what to collect? What do you do in that case? For example, Norton Simon was a collector even though he was married to Jennifer Jones. I guess it, well, you answer, go ahead. Jennifer, you're muted or you're frozen, actually. There you go.
Okay. Hi, Vivian. We tried really hard to discern when we could, having, for instance, if we knew that a son inherited from his parents, we would often not include the wife on that credit line. So we tried definitely to make the distinction of legal ownership wherever possible. So we really tried to dig deep into who was the legal owner, which is often incredibly complicated when it comes to women. But generally, especially with more well-known collectors like Norton Simon, it does become a bit easier in that regard. But so, yeah, this is again sort of, we tried to establish rules, but it really ended up being sort of a case-by-case basis as the research comes up.
From Allison Lee to Jennifer, speaking of complicating already complicated histories, I'm wondering if we have any sense of why these women were interested in collecting Gauguin. His work is so often seen as problematic in terms of his objectification of women and in terms of racial dynamics, and I'm wondering where that might intersect with women's collecting practices. Did women collect more of his still lives, or did they frequently buy the figurative paintings and nudes?
Yeah, so we are working with our tech development team to roll out some new features. One of those will be search functions to be able to sort of do queries like this. So we're hoping that in the near future, we'll be able to sort of sort by subject matter. We haven't really taken on these investigations ourselves at this stage, but I think soon we'll be able to sort of, you'll be able to search like Elizabeth did by Mrs., and then we can also search, sort of narrow it down by still lifes or portraits and that sort of thing. But I think that will be a really, really interesting line of questioning that we can follow shortly.
This one could be for anyone really, but how are you, it's anonymous, incorporating LGBTQ plus voices into these databases? How does varying gender identity play into this process? One thing I would say, we're having trouble enough figuring out that they're women and who they're married to. It's a little bit at the beginning stages of this, and of course, not only the women and their names and their roles were hidden. A lot of what we're talking about is 19th century or earlier or early 20th century. So I think, we're sort of started just identifying people by a very traditional definition of gender.
Well, it's the gender assigned at birth and I probably should have said that to you for the archives directory because that made it easier. If you read their bios, you'll find out more information about them.
Yeah, it's a lot of this digging and detective work, and a lot of the databases themselves, as I said, they have outdated information. They have very little information, but they come from written or typed resources that were created in the 1920s and 30s, and the effort, it's a massive effort to try and get all this information online in any kind of form, whether in an interactive database that you can search or an online catalog as WPI is doing, or just even, taking a digital image of it. So there's just tons and tons of work to be done in all of this. So.
If I could just jump in, Louisa, I just think that question is great because it really is a call to arms for this work to be done. And oftentimes, those of us who are provenance researchers realize that the archives are really stacked against us. There is always a narrative slant because the documentation is written by men about men. And as you saw with Mrs. Martin, she's sitting there in the audience and nobody speaks to her. So it's really our job from the vantage point of the 21st century to do this work and to uncover this information that might not be there in the archive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in too and say I felt like an activist putting together the archives directory, because if I found a woman collector or a dealer, I would finish their entry before a man. I was like, I'm doing this. They're getting finished first. And I did want to say that I have about 850 women in the back end of the directory. So if I found them and I couldn't finish them, I put their name there with the references so I could go back and fill in that information. So even just doing that, and I've also made a priority of featuring Black, African American, Asian, minority populations in the directory. So you'll find that in there, but by how they identified themselves in a search, keyword search.
I'm just answering a few because we're running over time, but we have two more questions here. So many of these projects include data that is updated and iterative over time. Have there been conversations around determining ways to alert users to changes in the data? Or is the assumption that researchers will continue to check back for new information? I would say that the latter is the case.
We set up the RSS feed in the archives directory early on, which is old technology. So we need to think about a newer way to but if you bookmarked it using Evernote or any of those kind of bookmarking software, you'd be able to go right back and find it.
Okay, and one more. Have you considered issues regarding the assignment of gender for historical figures? Considering for women, well, this gets, especially for people no longer living, considering for women, we can only really base an assignment feminine. It is very... the real question, I think, here is this something that could perhaps be acknowledged in the database? And yeah, that's a great suggestion. I think it's a fabulous suggestion. With pharaohs, for instance, we're trying to create statements and write papers actually on the fact that our photo archives are so Eurocentric. It's ridiculous. It's just Western art. What does that say about the whole canon of art history, that we've left out everybody else? It's just like these major institutions all over the world have just, collected photographs of works of Western art. And so we're trying to be self-reflective and kind of say, what does that mean about art history as a field? So there's just tons of work, as I said, to continue doing at the moment. Couple more, just one more. It's actually someone currently working on digitizing archives. What specific elements of ephemera and physical materials do you wish were more prevalent in metadata for searchability? I just say, well, my answer is the more the merrier. As much as you can get in there, it just helps the richness of the resource. The more you leave out, that if it's there somewhere, you leave it out, the researchers down the line. And especially as we're more and more digital, if you're not putting it in the digital source, there's less and less people going to the original resources, which we still say you should. And it's, but yeah, the more the merrier. Okay, so thank you all. Are there any last minute comments or from the panelists that you'd like to put forth? Or
I did, Louisa, I just added into the chat. Well, I've added it several times, the link to register for future things. So that'll take you to show you everything that's coming up. And what's coming up next, if I can share my screen quickly. No, I can't. I'll just leave it at that. Go to the link. You'll see what's coming up next, and you can register for our upcoming parts of it.
We have 3 more Wednesdays in June, so come join us for lunch. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.